It was a quiet night, and the world outside was still. The only sound in my room was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I remember staring at it, the faint glow of its hands marking 2:17 a.m. My fiancé wasn't beside me, though he should have been. I thought he'd gone to get water or was working late in his office again. But there was a strange unease creeping into my chest, an irrational whisper in my mind telling me something wasn't right. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sharp vibration breaking the silence like shattered glass. I grabbed it quickly, my pulse quickening as I saw the number. It wasn't one I recognized. My hand hesitated, hovering above the screen, but curiosity, or perhaps fear, compelled me to answer. "Hello?" My voice was low and tentative, the kind of tone you use when you don't want to disturb a predator. The voice on the other end was deep, gruff, and chillingly calm. "If you want your fiancé to live, you'll bring $100,000 to the old park downtown. You have 1 hour." My blood ran cold, and I gripped the phone tightly as though it were my lifeline. "What? Who is this? What are you talking about?" My voice cracked under the weight of panic, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. "No questions. 1 hour. If you call the police or tell anyone, you'll never see him again." The line went dead. For a moment, I sat frozen, clutching the phone as the words echoed in my mind. My fiancé? Kidnapped? My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled out of bed. I couldn't think straight, couldn't even process what was happening. But one thought pushed through the chaos. I had to save him. I tore through the house, my hands trembling as I grabbed the emergency cash we'd been saving for years. It wasn't $100,000, it was barely $85,000, but I stuffed it into a bag, hoping, praying, it would be enough. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. The drive to the park was a blur. The roads were empty, the city asleep, but my mind raced with horrific possibilities. What if I was too late? What if they'd already hurt him? I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white, tears streaming down my face as I whispered his name like a mantra, as if it could somehow protect him. When I arrived at the park, the eerie quiet sent shivers down my spine. The playground looked like a shadowy skeleton in the dim light of the street lamps. I parked the car and stepped out, clutching the bag to my chest like it was my heart. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood. He walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, his presence as cold and suffocating as the night air. "Do you have it?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I held out the bag, my fingers trembling as I offered it to him. "Please, just let him go." The man took the bag without a word, his gloved hand brushing against mine for a fleeting, icy moment. He stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. "Go home," he said from the darkness, his voice disembodied and haunting. "He's safe." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the weight of fear and exhaustion kept me silent. I stumbled back to the car, my legs weak and my mind spinning. The drive home felt endless, every minute stretching into an eternity. When I finally opened the door to our house, I was met with silence. My heart pounded as I made my way to the bedroom, terrified of what I might find. There he was, my fiancé, lying in bed, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. For a moment, I thought I might collapse from relief. I stood there, staring at him, the bag of money and the shadowy figure at the park playing over and over in my mind like a broken record. But something didn't feel right. The way he slept so peacefully, as if nothing had happened, it gnawed at me. I reached out to touch him, my hand trembling, and he stirred, blinking up at me with sleepy confusion. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, his voice groggy. I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Was it all some horrible prank? A cruel coincidence? I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that the fear, the panic, and the desperation I had felt were real, and they had left a mark on me I couldn't erase. When I first met him, I didn't know he would change my life. He wasn't the type I thought I'd fall for, not the polished, ambitious type my parents always envisioned for me. They had their ideals, their vision of the perfect future for their only daughter, but love has a way of defying expectations. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels sharp and alive, carrying the faint scent of leaves and the promise of winter. I had been standing outside an art gallery, scrolling through my phone while waiting for a friend who, true to form, was running late. That's when he approached me. Waiting for someone, or just enjoying the cold? His voice was warm, teasing, with a hint of a smile behind it. I glanced up, ready to brush him off with some polite excuse, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't traditionally handsome, not in the polished magazine cover way my parents would have approved of. His hair was slightly messy, his coat worn but somehow charming, and his smile, it was disarming, genuine, like he wasn't trying to impress me, but still somehow did. "I'm waiting," I replied, my tone cautious but not cold. Something about him made it hard to pull away. "Well," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets, "if whoever it is doesn't show, let me know. I could use a partner to make fun of all the pretentious art inside." I laughed despite myself. It was a soft, quick laugh, the kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. I didn't give him my number that night, but I saw him again a week later, completely by chance, at a coffee shop near my apartment. He claimed it was fate. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't say no when he asked if he could join me. His name was David, and he was everything I didn't know I needed. He wasn't rich, powerful, or connected, qualities my parents had always drilled into me as essential in a partner. Instead, he was kind, funny, and unshakably confident in a way that wasn't arrogant, but comforting. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, barely scraping by most months, but he loved what he did, and he had dreams bigger than his bank account. For someone like me, who had grown up in the shadow of wealth and expectations, his world felt refreshingly real. My parents, though rich beyond measure, had always been stingy when it came to me. They believed in self-reliance, they said, in teaching me the value of hard work. So while my friends grew up with allowances that could rival small salaries, I had to earn my way through summer jobs and part-time work. I resented it then, but I see now it shaped me into someone who could stand on her own 2 feet. David, on the other hand, came from a modest family, comfortable but never wealthy. He didn't care about my parents' money or their name, and I loved that about him. He saw me for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. We started small, coffee dates, long walks through the city, late-night talks about dreams and fears. I told him things I'd never shared with anyone, not even my closest friends, like how my parents' expectations suffocated me, or how I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. Our love grew slowly but surely, like a fire that starts with a single spark and steadily builds until it's roaring. He brought out a side of me I didn't know existed, a carefree, adventurous side that laughed more, worried less, and saw the beauty in little things. He'd surprise me with flowers picked from a roadside stand, or take me on impromptu trips to hidden parts of the city. There was one night, about a year into our relationship, that stands out in my memory. We were sitting on the roof of his tiny apartment building, sharing a bottle of cheap wine and staring at the stars. He turned to me, his eyes serious but soft, and said, "I know I can't offer you the kind of life you're used to, but I promise, I'll always make you feel loved." In that moment, I believed him, completely, utterly, without a shred of doubt. I didn't care about the future or what my parents would think. All I cared about was the way he made me feel, safe, cherished, alive. When he proposed a year later, it wasn't in some grand, orchestrated way. There were no cameras, no expensive dinners, no dazzling rings. It was just us on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting on the couch with coffee in hand. He looked at me and said, "I don't want to wait anymore. Will you marry me?" The answer was easy. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if I was blinded by the purity of those early days. If I missed the warning signs because I wanted so badly to believe in him, in us. At the time, I thought I'd found my forever. Now, as I sit here trying to piece together the man I fell in love with and the man who slept soundly while I risked everything for him, I don't know what to believe anymore. It wasn't a sudden shift, nothing as obvious as a screaming argument or a dramatic betrayal. It was a slow, almost imperceptible change, like a hairline crack in a piece of glass. At first, you don't even notice it, just a tiny flaw, easy to ignore. But over time, it grows, spreading and deepening, until one day the whole thing shatters. The first time I noticed something was off, we were at a cafe near my parents' house. It had been a stressful week for both of us. He was struggling with a client who couldn't make up their mind, and I was swamped with deadlines at work. We had gone out for coffee to relax, to reconnect, but the conversation quickly took a turn I wasn't expecting. "You know," David began, stirring sugar into his latte, "it wouldn't kill your parents to help us out a little. They've got more money than they know what to do with." I froze, the spoon in my hand hovering above my cup. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though his words had already set off an uneasy feeling in my chest. He shrugged, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. "I mean, look at us. We're working our asses off, barely making ends meet, while they're living in that mansion, throwing money around like it's nothing. If they gave us even a fraction of what they have, it would make a huge difference." "They've never been the kind of parents who just hand out money," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "And besides, I don't want their money. I've worked hard to build my own life." He laughed, but it wasn't the warm, affectionate laugh I loved. It was something else, dismissive, almost mocking. "Come on, babe. You're telling me you've never thought about how much easier life would be if they just helped out a little? I mean, they're your family. What's the point of having all that wealth if you're not going to share it?" The conversation stuck with me long after we left the cafe. It wasn't just what he had said, but the way he had said it, like he expected me to agree, to see the logic in his argument. It made me question something I had never questioned before: his motives. Did he see me as a person, or as a gateway to a lifestyle he couldn't achieve on his own? I tried to brush it off, to tell myself I was overthinking. After all, we were under a lot of stress. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But once the thought was planted, it was hard to shake. It wasn't long after that he started bringing it up more often. Whenever money was tight, which was often, he would find a way to circle back to my parents. "If your dad could just lend us enough for a down payment on a house," he would say, or, "Why don't you just ask your mom for help? She loves you, she'd understand." Each time, I would push back, insisting that wasn't the kind of relationship I had with them, but the conversations left me feeling unsettled. There were other moments too, small things that didn't seem significant on their own, but together painted a picture I didn't want to see. The way he would get irritated when I wanted to spend time with my friends instead of him. The way he always seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel guilty, like I was the one being unreasonable. The way he dismissed my concerns, always with a laugh or a joke, as if my feelings were something to be brushed aside. For the first time, I started to wonder if I could truly trust him. It was a terrifying thought, one I didn't want to face. But then, just as the doubts were beginning to take root, he proposed. It was such a simple moment, but it felt like everything I had been waiting for. He didn't get down on one knee or make a big show of it. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I could only describe as love, and said, "I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" In that instant, all my doubts melted away. The cracks I had noticed seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the overwhelming joy I felt. This was the man I loved, the man who had shown me a world beyond my parents' rigid expectations. Whatever flaws he had, they didn't matter. What mattered was that he loved me and wanted to build a future with me. I said yes, of course. How could I not? The ring wasn't expensive, just a simple gold band with a tiny diamond, but it was perfect. It was us. For a while, everything felt like a dream. Wedding planning consumed our days, and the excitement of building a life together pushed all my fears and doubts to the back of my mind. I told myself I had been overthinking, letting stress and insecurity get the better of me. But deep down, a tiny part of me couldn't forget those moments. The conversations about my parents, the dismissive laughter, the subtle ways he made me question myself. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that every relationship had its challenges. But now, looking back, I wonder if those were the moments I should have paid attention to. If those were the signs I ignored because I wanted so desperately to believe in him, in us. It's funny, isn't it? How love can blind you to the truth, even when it's staring you in the face. How you can convince yourself that the cracks aren't there, that the glass isn't about to break, But the thing about cracks is, they never stay small for long. The morning after that horrific night felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog that wouldn't lift. The events replayed in my mind on a loop. The phone call, the park, the shadowy figure, and the sight of David sleeping soundly in our bed as though nothing had happened. I barely slept, tossing and turning, trying to make sense of it all. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't rest. When I finally opened my eyes, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt intrusive, too bright for the turmoil I felt inside. David wasn't beside me. I heard the sound of the shower running, the water beating against the tiles. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy with unanswered questions. My gaze drifted to the nightstand, where David's phone sat, the screen lighting up briefly as a notification came through, then another, and another. It wasn't unusual for him to get messages. He was always busy with clients and projects, but this felt different. The buzzing was incessant, urgent. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I hesitated, the weight of last night's events pressing down on me. I wasn't the type to invade someone's privacy, but a part of me, a part that had been growing ever since he started acting differently, couldn't resist. I reached for the phone, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The screen was locked, a simple passcode, but one I didn't know. My stomach twisted into knots. Why didn't I know it? In a relationship built on trust, shouldn't this have been something we shared? I heard the water stop and panic set in. I quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand and sat up, trying to compose myself. When David emerged from the bathroom, a towel slung low around his hips, he froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the phone in my hand. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp, almost accusatory. I just picked it up. It was buzzing a lot, I said, stumbling over my words, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced as I watched his face shift, his expression tightening. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides and snatched the phone from my hand. "You shouldn't be going through my stuff," he said, his tone defensive, almost angry. "I wasn't," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands betrayed me, shaking as I gripped the blanket. It was going off, and I thought it might be important." His reaction set off alarm bells in my mind. He was never this protective of his phone before. Why now? What was he hiding? "Look," he said, his tone softening slightly, but still laced with irritation. "I've got a lot on my plate right now. Work stuff, you know. I don't need you snooping around and making it harder." I wanted to argue, to tell him that his reaction only made me more suspicious, but before I could, the weight of last night's events crashed over me again. The fear, the panic, the desperation, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "David," I said, my voice breaking, "I need to tell you what happened last night." He frowned, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand, and sat down on the edge of the bed. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as I recounted the night. I told him about the call, the threat, the ransom, how I'd gathered all the money we had and raced to the park, terrified that something had happened to him. My voice trembled as I spoke, my hands clutching the sheets like they were the only thing grounding me. When I finished, I expected him to comfort me, to thank me for doing what I thought I had to do to save him. But his reaction was nothing like I imagined. "You did what?" he yelled, his voice rising with every word. "You gave away all our savings? Are you out of your mind?" I stared at him, stunned. "I thought you were in danger. They said they had you, David. What was I supposed to do?" His face twisted in anger, and he stood, pacing the room. "That wasn't just your money," he said, his tone venomous. "That was my money, too. Do you have any idea what you've done? We have nothing now." Tears welled up in my eyes as I watched him, his anger cutting through me like a blade. "I was trying to save you," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I thought they were going to kill you." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression cold and unforgiving. "Well, congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You saved me, but now we're broke." "David," I started, but he cut me off. "No," he snapped. "You're going to fix this. You're going to call your parents and ask them for help. We don't have a choice now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You want me to go to them? After everything we've talked about? After everything we've been through? Yes, he said without hesitation. Unless you've got some other magical way to make $100,000 appear out of thin air. I felt the tears spill over, running down my cheeks as I stared at the man I thought I knew, the man I thought I loved. I can't believe you're saying this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Well, believe it, he said, his tone flat and unforgiving. Because if you don't, we're screwed. In that moment, something inside me broke. The trust, the love, the faith I had in him, it all shattered, leaving me with a hollow ache in my chest. The man I had given everything for, the man I thought would stand by me through anything, was gone. Or maybe he had never been there at all. The next morning, I forced myself to get dressed and leave the house. The weight of David's anger from the night before still hung heavy in the air, making every movement feel like wading through quicksand. He had insisted I go to my parents, demanded it even, and though I hated the idea of asking them for money, especially for him, I didn't see another way. The thought of telling them everything, of admitting how messy things had gotten, made me feel sick, but I had no choice. The drive to my parents' house was a blur, the familiar streets offering little comfort. Their estate loomed ahead, pristine and imposing, a stark contrast to the chaos of my life. I parked in the long driveway and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. When I walked in, my mother was seated in the sunlit living room, sipping tea, while my father read the newspaper. They looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting from surprise to mild concern. "Darling, what brings you here so early?" my mother asked, setting her teacup down with a delicate clink. I hesitated, wringing my hands as I searched for the right words. I need to talk to you. It's about David and me." My father folded his newspaper and leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying me. "What's wrong?" As I recounted the events of the past few days, I saw their faces darken. I didn't tell them everything. I left out the part about the ransom and the money, but I explained enough for them to understand we were in financial trouble. My voice shook as I asked for their help, for a loan to get us through this. When I finished, there was a long silence. My mother looked at my father, her expression pained, before turning back to me. "We can't do that," she said softly, though her tone was firm. I blinked, caught off guard. "What? Why not?" "It's not about the money," my father said, his voice steady but unyielding. "It's about David. We've had our concerns about him for a while now. He's reckless, irresponsible, and frankly, we don't trust him." I felt my chest tighten, a mix of frustration and shame burning inside me. "But this isn't about him," I argued. "This is about us, about keeping things together." "Is it?" my father countered, his tone cutting through me like a blade. "Because it sounds like you're the one holding everything together while he sits back and benefits." I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped. Deep down, I knew they were right. I hated that they were right. "I'm sorry," my mother said, reaching out to place a hand on mine. "We love you, but we can't support something we don't believe in. You deserve better." I left their house with tears streaming down my face, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. They were my last hope, and now I had nothing. When I got home, David was waiting for me, pacing the living room with barely contained anger. "Well?" he demanded as soon as I walked through the door. "They said no," I said, my voice cracking. "They don't trust you." His face twisted into a mask of rage, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. He slammed his hand down on the coffee table, sending a stack of magazines flying. "Of course they don't trust me," he spat. "Your parents have hated me from the beginning. They've been waiting for a reason to screw us over." "David, please," I said, trying to calm him, but he wasn't listening. "No, this is on you," he shouted, pointing a finger at me. "You couldn't even convince your own parents to help us. You let them walk all over me, and now we're screwed because of it." I flinched at his words, the weight of his accusations pressing down on me. He stormed around the room, knocking over a chair and kicking a bag by the door. "You ruined everything," he yelled, his voice echoing through the house. I didn't say anything, too stunned to respond. He grabbed his coat and muttered something about taking the dog for a walk before slamming the door behind him. The house fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I sank onto the bed, my body trembling as I tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. That's when I noticed it. David's phone, lying on the bed where he'd left it in his rush. For the first time, it wasn't locked. My heart raced as I picked it up, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I hesitated, a small voice in the back of my mind telling me to put it down, to walk away. But the larger part of me, the part that had been living with doubt and fear for far too long, pushed forward. I opened his messages and began scrolling, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words on the screen. At first, it didn't make sense. Cryptic exchanges, strange numbers, vague references. But then I saw it. A text thread with someone labeled only as X. It's done. She brought the money. David. Good. Make sure you disappear. I don't want her finding out. X. You owe me. Don't forget. David. You'll get the rest soon. My blood turned to ice as the realization hit me like a freight train. The ransom, the threats, the fear. It had all been a lie. He had orchestrated everything. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. This man, the one I had loved, the one I had trusted with my life, had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. I dropped the phone onto the bed and buried my face in my hands, tears streaming down my cheeks as the weight of his deception crushed me. The cracks I had ignored for so long had finally shattered the illusion, leaving me with nothing but the harsh, unforgiving truth. After finding the text on David's phone, my world felt like it had collapsed. The man I had loved, trusted, and sacrificed so much for had orchestrated my nightmare. My hands trembled as I took photos of the messages, carefully capturing every detail. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't let this betrayal paralyze me. I needed to act. I grabbed my coat and the phone, barely stopping to lock the door behind me as I rushed out into the cold night. The drive to the police station felt like it took forever, though the streets were empty and traffic was non-existent. My mind was racing, a storm of anger, sadness, and disbelief swirling inside me. How could someone I loved so deeply do something so cruel? The station was quiet when I arrived, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the waiting area. I approached the front desk, my voice shaking as I explained that I needed to report a crime. The officer on duty gave me a concerned look and asked me to wait while they called someone to speak with me. A few minutes later, a woman in plain clothes approached. She had a calm, reassuring demeanor, her eyes kind but sharp. She introduced herself as Detective Harper and led me into a small, private room. "Take your time," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Start from the beginning." I told her everything: the ransom call, the money, David's reaction, and what I found on his phone. My voice cracked more than once, and tears threatened to spill over, but Detective Harper listened patiently, nodding as I spoke. When I showed her the photos of the messages, her expression darkened, but she didn't interrupt. "You did the right thing coming here," she said once I had finished. "I know this is overwhelming, but we're going to handle this. You're not alone in this." Her words were like a lifeline, grounding me in a moment where I felt like I was drowning. She explained the process, detailing how they would investigate and gather evidence. It was clear that she knew how to handle cases like this, and her confidence gave me a glimmer of hope. "First," she said, "we need to secure the evidence. Do you have his phone?" I handed it over, my fingers reluctant to let go. It felt like giving away the last piece of control I had, but I knew it was necessary. Detective Harper reassured me that they would handle everything carefully, that the evidence would be key in building a case against David. She asked me a few more questions, taking notes as I spoke. With every detail I provided, I felt a small weight lift off my chest. By the time we were done, the suffocating fear I had felt earlier had eased, replaced by a quiet determination. "You should go home and rest," Harper said gently as we wrapped up. "We'll take it from here. I'll keep you updated, but you need to be ready for what comes next. It might take some time, and it won't be easy, but you've already taken the hardest step." I nodded, though the thought of going back home filled me with dread. The house felt tainted now, a place where David's lies had festered. Still, I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I thanked Detective Harper, her words of encouragement echoing in my mind as I left the station. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where David had yelled at me just hours earlier. The anger I had felt was still there, but now it was joined by an overwhelming sadness. I thought about the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had made me feel safe and cherished. Was any of it real? Or had he been lying to me from the start? I barely slept that night, my thoughts racing as I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed. Morning came too quickly, the sunlight spilling through the windows, stark and unforgiving. I had just finished making coffee when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't a knock, really. It was a thunderous pounding that made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. Before I could react, the door burst open, a group of officers in tactical gear flooding into the house. "Police! Stay where you are!" one of them shouted, their presence filling the space with an almost tangible energy. David appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice loud and indignant. "David Carter, you're under arrest," one of the officers said, stepping forward with handcuffs at the ready. "We have a warrant to search the premises and seize any relevant evidence." David's eyes widened in shock, but then his expression hardened. "This is insane," he yelled as they pulled his hands behind his back. "I don't know what you think I did, but this is a mistake." I stood frozen, watching as they led him down the stairs. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or betrayal. But then his face twisted into anger. "You did this," he hissed as they pushed him past me. "You're ruining my life." I didn't respond. What could I say? His words stung, but I knew the truth now, and nothing he could say would change that. The officers took his phone and a few other items, explaining that they would be analyzed as part of the investigation. One of them stayed behind to go over the process with me, their tone professional but empathetic. When they finally left, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat alone in the silence, the weight of everything settling over me like a heavy blanket. All I could do now was wait. Wait for the results, wait for justice, wait for the pieces of my life to start falling back into place. It was a strange, painful limbo, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming my life, and no matter how long it took, I was determined to see it through. The trial was grueling, but it brought a strange sense of closure. I sat in the courtroom, my hands gripping the edges of my chair as the judge read the verdict. Guilty. David and his accomplices were sentenced, their carefully orchestrated scheme laid bare for everyone to see. The weight of the evidence, the text messages, the financial transactions, the testimonies, had been overwhelming. Watching him taken away in handcuffs, his face pale and devoid of the charm I once fell for, was both painful and liberating. In the weeks that followed, the pieces of my life began to slowly fall back into place. The money I had lost in the ransom was returned, a bittersweet reminder of everything I had gone through. It wasn't just the financial loss that had shaken me. It was the betrayal, the deep wound of realizing how easily love could be twisted into a tool for manipulation. But with the money back in my hands, I was able to take the next step, selling the house. The house had once felt like a symbol of our future, the place where we would build a life together. But now it was tainted, a constant reminder of his lies. I couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep in the same rooms where his deceit had unfolded. The decision to sell was easy, and when the papers were signed, I felt a small sense of freedom. I moved back to my parents' house. It wasn't what I had imagined for myself at this stage in life, but it felt like the right place to heal. My old room had been untouched, preserved like a time capsule of my younger self. Walking into it was both comforting and jarring, a reminder of who I was before David, before everything fell apart. My mother, ever the perfectionist, had mixed feelings about my return. She loved having me close, but couldn't resist the occasional jab about my choices. "I always said he wasn't right for you," she would remark over tea, her tone sharp but not cruel. "You should have seen it too." It stung, but I knew her criticism came from a place of love, however misguided it felt at times. She had always been protective, and in her own way, this was her way of trying to shield me from future mistakes. My father, on the other hand, welcomed me home with open arms. He wasn't one for long, emotional speeches, but his actions spoke louder than words. He'd invite me outside to help with chores around the house, fixing the fence, planting flowers, cleaning out the shed. At first, I thought it was just a way to keep me busy, but over time, I realized it was his way of helping me rebuild my confidence. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said one afternoon as we painted the front porch together. His voice was calm, steady, the way it had always been when I was a child. "This is just a bump in the road. You'll come out of it stronger." His words stayed with me, a quiet source of strength on the days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. Slowly, I began to settle into this new rhythm of life. The mornings were peaceful, the evenings calm. I spent more time with my parents than I had in years, rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten in the chaos of my relationship with David. My mother's criticisms softened over time, replaced by a quiet pride as she saw me regain my footing. She started teaching me some of her favorite recipes, her hands moving deftly as she showed me how to knead dough or season a roast just right. Cooking with her became a kind of therapy, a way to bond and to reclaim a sense of normalcy. I also found solace in the garden, a place my father and I tended together. There was something healing about working with my hands, about watching something grow and thrive under my care. It felt symbolic, a reflection of my own journey. With every flower that bloomed, I felt a little piece of myself coming back to life. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. The frantic, chaotic energy that had consumed me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. I started to find joy in the small things: a good book, a sunny afternoon, the sound of birds outside my window. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was mine, and I was learning to love it. David's name rarely came up in conversation, and when it did, it felt like talking about a stranger. The man I had loved no longer existed in my mind. He had been replaced by the man who had betrayed me, the man who now sat behind bars. I didn't hate him. I didn't have the energy for that, but I didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness felt too much like letting him off the hook. As the months passed, I began to think about the future again. It was a tentative thought, like stepping onto thin ice, but it was there. I didn't know where I was going or what I wanted, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had options. My parents, despite everything, had become my greatest support system, their love a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, my father turned to me and said, "You've got your whole life ahead of you, kid. Don't let this be the thing that defines you." His words hit me harder than I expected, a reminder that I had the power to shape my own story. I didn't have to be the woman who was betrayed or the woman who was broken. I could be something more, something better. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope, not just for the future, but for myself. The idea of writing to David came to me one evening as I sat in my room, a gentle breeze drifting through the open window. At first, I laughed at the absurdity of it. Why should I waste my time on him? He didn't deserve another second of my thoughts. But the more I considered it, the more I realized this letter wasn't for him. It was for me. A way to finally close the door on that chapter of my life, to say everything I never had the chance to say. So I sat down at my desk, pen in hand, and began to write. Dear David, I hope this letter finds you well. Or rather, I hope it finds you exactly where you deserve to be. Sitting in that cold, gray cell, surrounded by the walls you built for yourself, with all the time in the world to reflect on the choices that brought you there. Choices that, let's be honest, were driven by greed, arrogance, and a complete lack of integrity. Do you remember the person I was when we met? The naive, hopeful woman who believed in love and second chances? The one who saw the best in you, even when you didn't deserve it? That woman is gone, but don't worry. She's been replaced by someone far stronger, far smarter, and far more resilient than you could ever imagine. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I would say to you if I had the chance. For a while, I thought I'd scream, yell, demand answers. But now I realize that you're not worth my anger. Anger gives you too much power, and you don't deserve even a fraction of it. So instead, I want to thank you. Yes, you read that right. Thank you, David. Thank you for showing me exactly what I don't want in my life. Thank you for teaching me that love is not about sacrifice and suffering, but about mutual respect and trust, two things you clearly know nothing about. And thank you for proving that I am capable of surviving the worst and coming out stronger on the other side. While you've been sitting in your cell, I've been rebuilding my life. I sold the house, the one you tainted with your lies, and moved back in with my parents. At first, it felt like a step backward, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. My parents, despite their flaws and occasional critiques, have been my rock. They've reminded me of my worth, something you worked so hard to make me forget. I found peace in the little things, cooking with my mom, gardening with my dad, and rediscovering hobbies I had long forgotten. I've started to dream again, to plan for a future that has no room for people like you, a future that is entirely my own. Do you want to know the best part? I've realized that I don't need anyone to complete me. I don't need a partner to validate my existence or to make me feel whole. I am enough. In fact, I'm more than enough. And that's something you'll never understand because you've spent your life leeching off others, unable to stand on your own 2 feet. You may have thought you were clever, orchestrating that cruel little scheme of yours. You probably even convinced yourself that you were smarter than everyone else. But look where it got you. All your lies, your manipulations, they led you straight to where you belong. And me? I'm free. Free of your lies, your selfishness, and your toxicity. I've heard that karma has a way of balancing the scales, and I suppose your sentence is proof of that. But the real punishment, David, isn't the time you'll serve. It's knowing that you lost the best thing that ever happened to you. Not because I was perfect, but because I gave you something you'll never have again. Unconditional love. And you threw it away. I used to think about all the ways you hurt me, all the ways you betrayed my trust, and it would tear me apart. But now, I think about those things and I feel nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just indifference. You are a chapter in my story, but you are not the whole book. And trust me, the best parts are yet to come. So enjoy your time in that cell, David. Use it wisely. Maybe reflect on the choices you made, though knowing you, I doubt you'll learn anything. But that's not my problem anymore. You're not my problem anymore. I'll end this letter with the same words you spat at me the last time I saw you. You're ruining my life. The difference is, David, I didn't ruin your life. You did that all on your own. And me? I've just started building mine. Goodbye, David. For good this time. Sincerely, the woman who finally learned her worth. As I finished writing, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, like I had finally laid something heavy to rest. I didn't know if I'd ever send the letter. Maybe I'd burn it, or tuck it away in a drawer as a reminder of how far I'd come. Either way, it didn't matter. The act of writing it had been enough. I smiled to myself as I folded the letter and set it aside. The sunset outside painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.